When you let go of thinking activity and shift into an effortless abiding in pure awareness, you notice that the thoughts that come and go in your mind, all mental appearances, are impermanent. They come and they go, but awareness, the field of spaciousness in which they come and go, is not impermanent. It is continuous, it is eternal. The second thing you notice is that these appearances come and go on the screen of your own mind. They don't occur to other people. They're not out there. It's only your neural network and your preconditioned way of thinking, your mental conditioning, frames them in a certain way so that you see them through the lens of your own karma. So all of these appearances are mind only. And so these two insights are radical and significant in leading to enlightenment.
We're happy to invite Roger Calverley and Jon Arsenault to our show. And the topic will be Ati Yoga. This topic I'm not totally familiar with. I've done some background on it. In some ways, I may become the devil's advocate in this conversation, which could create a more stimulating process here. But I'm going to hand it over to Gary now, who is really steeped in this whole philosophy. I know he has an opinion about the way I'm going to approach it, but let's see what happens. So Gary, it's your show.
I like your approach because this way we'll do good cop, bad cop. But today I'll be the good cop and you'll be the bad. Usually I'm the bad cop, but we're going to do this because this is good because it creates a good dynamic. You're coming from a little different angle. Let's call it the Bhakti tradition, which I also, and so does Roger. I'm not sure about Jon. We share a background in the Bhakti tradition. Today we want to focus on Roger's latest book. It's called The Gospel of Garb Dorje, The Highest Secret Teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, so what I like about this situation is that Stefan, Roger, and I go back way, way back to our earliest spiritual adventure, and then we all, at a certain point, went our own different ways, and now we're coming back and kind of check as a little check-in, see where we've been, what we're doing. So, Roger, give us a little bit of background, a little bit of your history and how you came to discover the teachings known as Ati Yoga.
I joined a meditation group in 1973 or 74. And I was in that group for about 21 years. And it was an Indian spiritual teacher. And I learned a lot. But I graduated and developed a good inner connection with Sri Aurobinda and the mother. Now, interestingly, the guru under whom I had studied was a disciple of theirs. So the broad outlines of the teachings was the same, and I made a fairly easy adjustment. Several years into that new process, I was shopping at a flea market, and there was, among other books for sale, there was one by a Tibetan Lama. I purchased the book, and I realized that I wasn't quite putting together what he was saying. So I looked much more closely at it and began to get a few other books on Tibetan Buddhism. And I realized that I had far more ability to connect with other spiritual seekers on that path than I did spiritual seekers on the path of Sri Aurobindo, and also that the spiritual seekers on the Tibetan Buddhism path were more focused on actual practice than the Sri Aurobindo people, who tended to be intellectual and busy with many projects. So I began double tracking, and I completed all the recommended practices, shifted into Dzogchen, which is the highest level of Tibetan Buddhism, and then became aware of the original source texts behind Dzogchen, began to dive into those teachings, and realized that the translations were not really serviceable for the average spiritual seeker, and decided to frame those teachings or give them a new expression in language that would be really straightforward, accessible, clear, and useful to spiritual seekers. And from that came the book, The Gospel of Garab Dorje. So I have now a focus on Garab Dorje's teachings, which are not widely known in the West. And it's a more focused and pure form of Dzogchen than the Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana version of Dzogchen. So that's my basic story.
Well, that's a good story, and one I can totally relate to, because I also had my own experience and exploration of Buddhism. But before we go into that, let's bring in Jon.
My connection with Roger goes back to 2001, and we've maintained that connection over the years. And as I kind of, moved away and to Alberta from, pretty far away from Ontario, we maintained this connection, and I kind of would let him know where I was going on my spiritual journey. And it was during COVID, I believe, where we had talked. And then I said, I've been on a Buddhist path and I've been kind of progressing down this. And he said, well, there's this To Ati Yoga group that I'm going to be starting, and I think it will fall in line with the direction that you've been going in. And so right away from the start of that group, I've joined it, and it's just been the path I've been on. It's been, that was my introduction to it, and I'm really grateful for it.
Perfect. That's good. Now, Stefan, is there anything that you want to put in at this point?
Well, I just want to ask Roger a question, and I'm really glad he brought up the Aurobindo movement, because Aurobindo created integral yoga, which brings in all forms of yoga, including the more mental or intellectual side, which is something that you seem to adhere to now. But it also includes the bhakti side of yoga. And in spite of the fact that they were very busy at the Aurobindo ashram, Aurobindo himself still did focus on the illumined mind while bringing in the devotional side. Is that not correct?
Sri Aurobindo felt that Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Karma Yoga were the three pillars of his integral yoga. And his teaching was that each of them could come to the fore and be predominant depending on where the disciple was in his spiritual practice and his spiritual maturity. So many of the disciples in the actual ashram, and I've been there twice, focus on karma yoga in actual practice. Because the mother was an object of their devotion, they all had devotion to the mother. But for Sri Aurobindo himself, his own path was one of jnana yoga. Does that help?
Yes, that's really, actually, that's settled my whole question now, that I've been going back and forth with people on Messenger for the last couple of days about the acceptance that one can find a path to enlightenment or awakening in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be through jnana yoga. It doesn't have to be through bhakti yoga or karma yoga. It depends upon the resonance one has to that particular path of yoga, and there is no one way that is the only way. Is that correct?
I think you only find out what bhakti is when you've been on the path for a while. In other words, I graduated from university at the age of 22, and then I did another BA. So at the age of 23, I had a well-formed and focused intellect. So when I went into the path of my initial teacher, which was a devotional path, my intellect was predominant. But within a few years, my spiritual heart opened, and then my understanding of what devotion really was far greater than it could possibly have been when my energies were more focused in my intellect. And I think it's the same as jnana. Unless you come to the point of actual insight, you don't actually have a clue about what non-dualism, non-conceptuality, and real jnana or knowledge actually is. So you find out what the path is by walking the path and progressing in it. And progress means falling away of your preconceived notions about what these things are.
If you achieve enlightenment through bhakti yoga, the place you come to is the place that they all arrive at. And so there's a melding of all of them at one point. There's no differentiation. It's all the same goal, if you want to call it a goal, that one arrives at through these different paths.
If there's a you, and if yoga is an achievement, then you might be correct. But in the path of non-dual wisdom, the small self is recognized as not truly existent. It exists in the same way that the protagonist in last night's dream existed. For the duration of the dream, it's very convincing. When you wake up, there is no small self who does anything. And therefore, the attainment of a dream character falls apart when the dreamer wakes up, and it's not considered to be an actuality in Garab Dorje's Ati Yoga, for example. And also, because in our essential being, we are already enlightened beings, there is no achievement. There's only recognition of what has always been the case when ignorance falls away from your way of seeing things. So when you state it a certain way, you are implying the reality of the small self, who's the active seeker, the egoic mind, which organizes a big enlightenment project, and the outcomes of all of that seeking and striving is validated by achievement. These are not things which are taken seriously in our Ati Yoga.
Right, but see, that's where it all gets conflated, because for those who are not in that place that they intellectually understand what you're trying to convey, who are just looking for a way to either through deep meditation or some way to walk a path of awakening, there's multiple ways of doing it, forgetting about who the self is or what Dorje yoga is, Ati yoga is. There's still other ways of achieving enlightenment, just not one way.
Yes, of course. The goal is one, the paths are many. I share something in common with Gary in that we both started on a path where opening the spiritual heart and receiving the peace, light, and bliss from the source within your own being was the core teaching. And we both had some experience of that before discovering what Jnana Yoga was about. In actual fact, it's the same thing in Jnana Yoga. In the path of love, they call it love. In the path of wisdom, they call it wisdom. But it is still the light of your own essential being, which comes in and illumines the mind with insight or with love. And insight and love are the two wings that carry you anywhere in the spiritual life. If you don't have an open heart, you'll have very little wisdom. And if you lack wisdom, your heart's emotional devotion can only go so far.
Well, there's the answer that I was looking for. It finally came to the fore. Thank you very much. So in other words, my best access to awakening, to enlightenment, is through practicing devotion and deep meditation. And I have an open heart center, which when I go deep into meditation, I can feel physically and psychically being put into another space. Now, I assume that there is meditation involved in Ati Yoga, and at some point, by me going through the heart and you going through the illumined mind, we reach that same space. And you just expressed it in a way that there are alternatives, not just one way.
In Ati Yoga, there is recognition that I am not the doer. Therefore, there's no practice. Real meditation is done in and through you when you connect with a higher power that is beyond the control of your managerial egoic mind. But I'm sure you understand this as surrender. So love, devotion, and surrender are the bhakti path, and they're also there in the Ati Yoga path. Just they're not expressed through the same formulation.
Okay, so I have one other thing to bring up before we move on to Jon. In regard to meditation, since I've been meditating since the early 70s and have a fairly regular practice, I've gotten to the point where the current arises in me at any given time without me sitting down in front of an altar or shrine to go into that. It just is a switch that turns on, as I said, at any moment or time when I'm shifted into that consciousness without me actually trying to do it. I could be on the street and it happens. I've been in a photography meeting with a couple of people, and it inadvertently I went into that state, which my wife was fortunately with me at the time, who's my partner in photography, and had to bring me back down so I could, continue the conversation with the people. So it is something that was spontaneous in me. And I'm wondering if those states of spontaneity in that meditational area is something that you, and obviously you've experienced it as well. Can you talk about that for a second?
You are not the doer. In other words, you have the experience of a higher force kicking in and connecting the normal consciousness with a higher consciousness. So you realize that although you may call it practice, it's actually getting out of the way, which makes that possible. And it can happen at any time. So in Ati Yoga, it's called non-meditation or non-practice, because it's not that you do something to get something, it's that you get out of the way to allow clarity, to invite the presence in to be the real doer of what's called non-meditation. So the meditator in Ati Yoga is not a doer, and the practice is a non-practice, and the result is already pre-established because we're all enlightened in the core of our being once we get out of the way with our noisy intellects. So that's how it's proposed and described in Ati Yoga. And for me, that's a more clear formulation than I find in many of the Bhakti Yoga teachings.
So how do you get out of the way? Isn't that a practice in itself?
Doing and striving and seeking and practicing techniques is being in the way of what comes to you naturally and effortlessly when you drop all of that. So the prime practice is letting go in Ati Yoga. But also very important is opening up. When the heart opens up, the mind can let go. You then realize that being a non-doer is the greatest possible receptivity to that higher presence and power which comes in and accomplishes everything in and through the body-mind, which would otherwise be seeking and striving.
Well, okay, so, but before you reach that state in Ati Yoga, you hadn't gotten there yet. You just discovered Ati Yoga. What I'm trying to bring out is, how did you get to that point of not getting in the way? You must have read some instruction or seen it just didn't, you didn't wake up one morning and boom, you were out of the way. There had to be a process. Isn't that true?
Yes, I think insight into anatta was a big step in that direction. It's like seeing your last night's dream when the protagonist in that dream was utterly convincing. And then at some point, the dream stops and you wake up and you realize the whole thing was a fantasy. So all narratives in which there is an egoic protagonist are fantasies. When I saw that clearly, it was a big step.
No, for those who are not or may not be familiar with Buddhist terminology, Roger used a very specific term there, anatta. So tell us what anatta is.
Anatta is recognizing that the content in your mind generates a fixed idea you have that you are a separate self who doesn't have enlightenment and must therefore seek and strive and make efforts to get this something which would fulfill you, but you don't have it. You actually have and are the truth of your being. You covered it up by all your thinking activity, and all of this thinking activity has generated a notion that you are a separate self lacking what would fulfill you, which is not true.
And so anatta is, to translate that simply means no self. There is no certainly separate self and no self. So it's as you described, the sense of self is simply a mind generated fantasy. I have a topic I want to bring up, but let's go to Jon. Let's get some input for. So now so now let's just say, to simplify this, Stefan represents the bhakti path, love, devotion, surrender, which we're familiar with totally. And let's say Roger represents here, not that he doesn't have bhakti or is not familiar with it, but he's representing the wisdom path or the jnana path. So, and we're kind of going back and forth. I think this is great. It's rich. Let's hear from Jon. So what's your take on this whole?
Well, I think you literally finished up on the exact subject you and I had talked about and enjoyed in a public radio interview, no self, anatta. And the reason why Ati Yoga works so well for me is because that was a stumbling point for me when I was on a Buddhist path. The understanding of suffering being universal is very easy to grasp, very easy to understand. But when you started getting to the point of anatta, that's difficult. The absence of a fixed self is hard to actually conceptualize. When Roger said, well, Ati Yoga is something that you should look into, and I did, it really clarified and made simple. I'm a very simple type of person. I guess you could say my whole life I like to look into information and find the simplicity, sift through the sand to find the nugget of gold. And Ati Yoga appeals to me as a busy individual. I have a family, I have children, I have shift work, a job, I have a farm. Life is rich, but I look for something that's simple and cuts to the core. And when you get to Ati Yoga, you actually start looking at opening up, letting go. It becomes simple. And a person like myself who could be working night shifts, day shifts, have large stretches of time off, a lot of the other paths require a bit more consistency, or you're going to have to deal with certain group settings. Ati Yoga is all personal. You can just choose the time when you're going to practice non-meditation, when you're just going to enter into a state of presence and let thoughts and narratives just drift away. It's something that a person can do individually and independently. And that's really what appealed to me. So I just wanted to kind of lead into that before you had a question, because you literally left off on Anatta, which I said that was my biggest stumbling block, and that is what Ati Yoga really lifted for me, was that being a stumbling block.
I think Anatta, or the teaching or the principle of no self, I would say, based on my experience of like 60 years of doing this stuff, it might be the number one obstacle to realization or enlightenment or awakening for seekers in general. I would say, I would venture to say at this point that as long as there is a sense of separate self, then I would say the best path to follow would be the path of bhakti, or love, devotion, surrender, because it's like Ramakrishna. Once he had his pure non-dual realization, right? He got it. He went back and said, he prayed to the mother. He was a devotee of Mother Kali. He prayed, leave a little trace of ego, or the sense of separate self, so that I don't want to be the sugar. That's the pure non-dual realization. I want to taste the sugar. I want to be the devotee. So as long as there is a sense of separate self, then to be the devotee is the highest thing. If one, and going back to the example of Ramakrishna with his non-dual guru Totapuri, who got him there, once he realized he was the whole universe, or whatever the realization was, I am that, I'm the whole universe. There's only one thing going on here. There is no self or separate self. He could have stayed in that mode, but no, because I guess of his conditioning or whatever personality state, he wanted to be the devotee. So what I would put out at this point is that one thing that connects bhakti with or the devotion path or tradition with jnana or the wisdom tradition is this idea of surrender, because I think they both have to surrender has to come into play in both. You're not going to go very far in the bhakti path unless you're surrendering to that object of your devotion, whether it's Jesus, Mother Kali, I don't know, whoever is your chosen ideal. There has to be a surrender. But also, and I think Roger alluded to this earlier in his description of, non-doership or not doing, there's a surrender there, because the realization is in the non-dual path, in the path of jnana, is no, I am not the doer. I am not meditating. This is happening in me and through me, and I would say you get to the same place in the bhakti path. You realize, no, there's only you. There's only, thy will be done. There's only you, and it's all happening through me. So maybe we want to pick up a little bit on that topic of surrender, or if we have anything else, let's just get it out there.
Well, I like when you said non-doership, because that's also confusing. I mean, here I am in a body with a name, with a personality. I have a personality. I have the ability to look around me and see that I'm not, in fact, Gary or Stefan. And so what is non-doership? Essentially, it's really about losing the desire to strive for attaining results. It's about kind of breaking this loop of motivation that we're all caught up in when we create a goal and we try to aspire towards reaching an outcome. And then when you reach that outcome, you just create the next goal and the next goal. And I found myself on this hamster wheel of creating goals, achieving them, losing satisfaction, and then trying to go back and create more, till eventually, I could see that this cycle would just carry on forever. Some people are gifted with the ability to not be bothered by that. I was truly bothered by it and felt that I needed to dig further and deeper into finding a way to alleviate that. The Buddha described that as a form of suffering. And non-doership really is the answer to that. When you start to see that this fictional character you've created in your mind that has a narrative that creates an identity and says that it's special and unique and has plans and goals and wants to achieve a bunch of outcomes, and this thing can be let go, and you can find that you're still in this amazing body with this personality, with a rich external life of many things happening, but you are no longer the primary doer. Hopefully what I've said there makes sense. And I just, as soon as you said non-doership, I loved it.
Makes total sense because to me, that was the big that was the big shift. That was the crossing over, so to speak, to use the analogy, crossing over to the other shore or whatever, was the realization of I am not the doer. And
I
there's
would
no
like to tell
separate
people,
self, and there's no separate self here to be the doer. That's the illusion. That was my awakening, or part of the process, non-doership. So I think that's key: non-doership and no self in the non-dual teachings. Those are the two main principles. If there are more, shout them out. But non-doership is key, and anatta or no self is key. Without that, I think there's no insight into the pure non-dual teachings like Ati Yoga or other pure non-dual teachings. But to me, Ati Yoga is the pinnacle teachings in Buddhism. Again, as Stefan points out, hey, many paths. You don't have to be a Buddhist. And in fact, if you're an Ati Yogan, you're not a Buddhist, because you see that's just a construct. All these things. It's liberation from all these things. But anyway, I
well,
want to
absolutely.
hear from.
And I think it's very relevant too. Like, Ati Yoga right now is actually relevant for the generation I'm in and the generation coming up. There has been so much focus. We talk about being indoctrinated by a culture, and you have in the spiritual path, everyone knows this. You have to unlearn things that you've learned. You've built up an identity your whole life. You've been trained to go to school, develop a career, have a fixed sense of self. And then the unlearning process happens for those who go down a spiritual path, a relearning. Um, I would say, to be honest, the people that I see in life are being encouraged to develop stronger, fixed sense of self, to continue to really establish more and more of a fixed personality, and to really just narrow in on their identity. And I feel that Ati Yoga is it's the most accessible, easy, effortless thing that a person can do. You don't have to attend group sessions or go to conferences or follow gurus. There's none of that. It is so accessible that I'm happy to talk about it with anyone, and it should be simple as well. That's why it appeals to me. Is because the simplicity of it. You don't have to really go through years or decades of study or learning or practice or mantras or anything. You just simply hone in on the simplicity of opening up and letting go, and then allowing that presence, that active space that's in between thoughts, and this fixed sense of self, this narrative that you build in your mind. You allow that to just melt away, and it happens naturally without effort. So that's essentially my story, and why Ati Yoga is a subject I love. I was happy to get the invite today to speak on it.
Jonathan, do you believe
Yes.
you have a soul?
You know what? I grew up Christian and raised very good in a good family. I no longer believe that I have a fixed soul. I just, it's a tough one to get out. If I dig deep enough and say what part of me is going to be preserved, I can honestly say the only part is consciousness itself, which we already are a part of. There is no fixed Jon that's going to go through eons.
Basically, what sits in front of me that I'm looking at the three of you, this is all an illusion. And there's nothing but just we perceiving that there is something here, but it's really just an illusion.
No, I wouldn't say it's an illusion at all, because I would say that it's temporary. That it's temporary and needs to be identified for what it is. It's temporary. It's not permanent. And that's liberating. As soon as we can let go of this idea, like my personality, who I am in this body, the small self, it exists. I go to work, I drive, I have children, who I love very much. Great. But this idea that we as individuals are somehow fixed and there's an aspect of us that is preserved and carries on for eons, that is the part that dissipates.
What is the force that guides it all? If it's not a God, if you don't want to accept consciousness as something that's creating form, what is the thing, the essence that guides it all, that makes up this whole thing that we're involved in?
Well, it is consciousness itself. It's the universal one. I may struggle for words on this. I would have to apologize and say that compared to Gary and you and Roger, mine has been a very simple and just straightforward kind of thing. So sometimes even when we talk about the different, teachings and everything, I'm still catching up. But for me, I would not deny when people say God or, consciousness or universal one. I've heard these terms many a time. It just doesn't, the question doesn't, I wouldn't say appeal to me. It's just I don't have the question anymore. Though that makes sense, Stefan, that
Yes,
it's
of
like
course.
you lose the desire to have the question, and you may not formulate the answer. So I would say that when you said, do you have a soul? I would say I don't feel that I do, and I certainly don't believe that I do have a fixed sense of self. I'm not connected to that, but I do enjoy being alive and being in this body and appreciating what I have around and the experiences that I get to have. So it's not like a loss at all. There is no loss going through a non-duality experience.
I'll ask Roger, is there a guiding force here?
The analogy which I come back to time and again is that of the ocean and the waves. So the wave is the ocean in motion. You can talk about the wave being a wave, not an ocean. That's intellectually splicing hairs and making up definitions in your own mind. The wave really is the ocean, and the ocean expresses multiplicity through the generation of waves, all of which are one with their source. If you want to conceive of it as talking about waves going places and reincarnating and growing and developing and attaining enlightenment, you can. But all these waves have always been the ocean, and the ocean is the ocean of infinite consciousness.
Exactly. But I think people are going to want to know, what is the source? That are listening to this podcast, people are going to say, okay, I get the ocean and the wave is an aspect of it. But what is the source of all of this that you're trying to convey? Is there no thing that is the source?
The source is known not by intellectual explanations, but by direct experience of the reality of your own essential being. So you come closer to the source when you recognize the nature of the infinite consciousness. You come closer to source when your intellectual confusion clears away, and you do directly experience the peace, light, love, presence, bliss, and power of that existence within your own being. That's how knowledge of source comes about, not by intellectual descriptions.
But who's experiencing it? That's what I'm trying to get to, because we're the four of us are sitting here. Who is having the experience of that ultimate state? And if it is myself or Gary or you, Roger, or Jon, then there is something that is having that experience.
Consciousness experiences itself through the multiplication of forms which have a seeming individuality, but which are actually waves of the ocean. When they remember who they really are, they subside into being the ocean. When they arise into form, they can have perspectives, ideas, conceptual experiences, and separations within that dream. But then when they wake up, the dream disappears and the ocean of consciousness is there again.
I agree with you 100%. You did say consciousness, so we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, and the ocean and the wave analogy is what worked for me to understand conceptually. And yeah, no, I just agree with what Roger said there. Like it becomes difficult for me to put words on it. You get into a space of presence. It's called pristine continuum presence, where thought dissipates. A lot of my daily interaction now is spent absent of thought. You're just present and aware and open to life. And you don't have this chatter and this narrative in the back of the mind telling you what you need to do or what you need to focus on. You're losing a lot of this narrator in your head, this individual fixed sense of self that thinks it's a separate entity. And so I'm glad you asked, because I did struggle to answer the question at what point, how would you describe it? And I said, I don't really have words for it, but the practice of just simply putting yourself into that state of presence. I call it a practice because I think the default setting for most of us is still just to carry on doing things. And sometimes the chatter or the mind likes to be activated, but it's unnecessary most of the time. And so what I referred to as the practice is of putting yourself into a state of presence where you just open up and let go. Non-doership, relaxation, and making sure that you put yourself into that space as often as possible.
Consciousness is having the experience of multiplicity in all of these forms. Consciousness is the source of all that is happening in and through
Absolutely.
us. Okay,
Absolutely.
so that's the source. That is the source, which means there is something that is the source. Even though we become one with it, which is our what everybody would like to achieve, there is a source of consciousness that's formed this whole thing. I'm sorry for being the devil's advocate, but I really do have a lot of questions.
Oh, well, no problem at all.
I wanted you to be the devil's advocate because I don't want everybody sitting around agreeing with each other. That doesn't get us anywhere. I want the dynamism. So this is good because I'm thinking of these answers too. How would I answer these questions? It's not easy because whatever the source is, it is not conceivable. It's not something you can get there with your mind. So you have to grope around at some point. If you want to talk about it, you have to pick a word. So consciousness is about as good as it gets as far as I'm concerned, but there may be better words. I don't know.
Okay, but Gary, the reason I'm doing this, and I want everybody to understand this because I love this conversation. This is the conversation that we're having at a lot of enlightened dinner tables, I guess. But there are people out there that are going to listen to this podcast that are just starting to investigate because they are resonating with something that's saying, hey, you know what? My life is not just like you guys all did. My life is not happening like this. I think there's something bigger that I have to explore. But if we go to the top of the mountain and talk about it from that point of view without giving some foundation for what it really is all about, explaining to people who cannot grasp it on the highest intellectual level, I think we're doing an injustice. So what I'm trying to do is break it down so people who are listening say, I get it, okay? And it will be attracted to the form that you're talking about. And perhaps because we are going to list all the links to your websites and how people can get in touch with you. I want them to be excited about what you have to say. And I don't want the conversation to be above their level of understanding.
There's a very simple insight which anyone can have. When you stop thinking, you enter into a non-conceptual state. Before you start saying this is this and that is that, and practicing conceptual grasping, conceptual designation, fixation on the ideas in your mind, if you drop all of that, this is letting go, you enter into a non-conceptual state. You are conscious, but you're not conceptualizing. The non-conscious state is ipso facto non-dual. There is no this or that prior to your practice of conceptual designation and conceptual grasping. Anybody can validate this for themselves. To be non-conceptual is automatically to be in the recognition of non-duality. When the conceptual spin winds down, pristine awareness has no this or that or multiplicity or duality. There's nothing to grasp. So the questions all come about when you have this and that and an egoic mind which propels examination and investigation and interrogation of appearances. Prior to that, pristine consciousness itself is non-dual, it's non-conceptual. This is what is recognized in Ati Yoga, and abiding in that state brings to the fore the wisdom of non-duality and non-conceptuality. So source is non-dual, it's non-conceptual. You won't be able to grasp it by talking about it or interrogating.
So how does one start on the path, though? If somebody wants to get involved in Ati Yoga and really doesn't know the steps for getting to that point of non-conceptuality, what would you say to them is the way to start to do it?
Get the book, read the book, list your questions, connect with the Facebook group, ask your questions, and set aside time to practice meditation or what we call non-meditation. That would be initial steps in the right direction.
Can you describe the method by which you move into a Ati Yoga meditation?
Yeah, we have a very, very simple method. We use a recording which moves the brain waves through and beyond beta, alpha, theta, and into delta, which is pristine awareness with no conceptual activity. So that makes it really very easy within a few months to recognize what it is to be fully conscious, but no thinking activity grinding out intellectual questions.
Wow, I should have asked you that at the front, and we could have all gone out and had lunch. That basically hits the nail on the head. Thank you very much, Roger.
Let me throw something else here. Let me throw something else, because what Roger's alluding to, of course, are the whole what is it, binaural beats? What is it called, Roger? I use it.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I use it. I awake too. So okay, so somebody's starting out. Okay, I want to find out what what this is all about. This pinnacle teaching. What are you talking about? Okay, right. Get the book, and the reason why I recommend this book, among other reasons, is because it's written in language that can be understood. I have read many books, Buddhist texts, and I'll tell you, I finished them after 300 pages. I don't know what I've read, but Roger has put those teachings into language that you can read and understand. That's one. And then the binaural beats thing, enhancing the meditation, and I've used it to great effect. Really great. I use the I Awake program. Roger, you have another program. It doesn't matter which of you. What's your program?
Holosync.
Holosync. I use I Awake. The third thing, and I'm going to put a plug in here for me and Jon. Hey, if you want to explore this and you want to enhance this experience, Jon and I, and we have another friend. We do these. I call them divine feminine. Speaking about the bhakti thing, we're going to bring in the divine mother here. I call them divine feminine energy transmissions. We do that, and I don't want to say many cases because we don't have that broad a sample yet, but in some cases, it's been very, very effective. So if you're a young seeker or whatever, new seeker setting out, there's a whole lot of stuff available. You just have to get out there and do it. But I would start with the book, and Stefan will post a link to the book, because and if it doesn't resonate, fine, not for you, good. Go on to something else. It's not, it's like anything else. Why do you have all these paths? Because you have all these different kinds of personalities, temperaments, whatever. You want to say karma? I don't know. Whatever story fits you. But I'm just saying, this is not for everybody, and neither is that for everybody. Neither is Sri Aurobindo or the Bhakti Yoga or whatever you want to bring it out. It's not for everybody. But you can explore this, and maybe it'll resonate. I like what Jesus said, right? In other words, the sower of the seeds. All we can do or not do is, put it out there, and if it lands on fertile ground, great. If it lands on stony ground, okay, great. It's who's the doer and who's the controller? Certainly not me or any individual from my point of view.
Have you heard of the Awakened Mind System by Dr. Jeffrey Thompson? It's a hemisync album, okay? The Monroe Institute also uses hemisync or binaural beats to create a pathway. I'm curious if you're familiar with either of these.
I am not personally.
I'm not either.
Okay, so I've been using this the hemisync method for relaxation and for psychic transportation, trance places for quite some time. Jeffrey Thompson put out this album, and I got it in 2003. But you're basically using the hemisync method in these meditation techniques, Roger?
When I meditate, I put on earphones with the binaural beats. Brain waves are not the same as presence, but when brain waves keep your mind fixated on appearances in your mind, the awareness of pure presence is not as clear. So letting go means letting go of thinking activity, and recordings of that sort, when you listen to them with earphones on, are definitely a help to making the mind more clear so that you become more aware of the pristine awareness, which is beyond thinking activity.
Yeah, you're basically trying to put yourself in a space where there's no more noise, mental noise. And these holosync recordings are extremely helpful in getting you to the space where the mental noise can dissipate so you can see what remains in the absence of everything else.
It's interesting because this the hemisync or binaural beat practice has been going on for quite some time. And like I said, the Monroe Institute uses it to stimulate out-of-body travel. But it is definitely a way, and if people are interested, they should check it out, on Apple Music or something. So you sent me 2 YouTube meditations that were guided meditations, and they were wonderful. So I'm going to post those if you want me to underneath our podcast here. But you have your own binaural beats that you're using, Roger, that you've created?
No, I sent Jon an initial introduction to holosync. But I want to say something that is really significant. When you let go of thinking activity and shift into an effortless abiding in pure awareness, you notice that the thoughts that come and go in your mind, all mental appearances, are impermanent. They come and they go. But awareness, the field of spaciousness in which they come and go, is not impermanent. It is continuous, it is eternal. The second thing you notice is that these appearances come and go on the screen of your own mind. They don't occur to other people. They're not out there. It's only your neural network and your preconditioned way of thinking, your mental conditioning, frames them in a certain way so that you see them through the lens of your own karma. So all of these appearances are mind only. And so these 2 insights are radical and significant in leading to enlightenment. The impermanence of all appearances and the fact that these appearances occur to you personally only in the screen of your mind as preconditioned by your neural network, your mental conditioning, your expectations, and your notions. That's the fog through which all of this is seen and understood. And until you abide in pristine awareness, you don't actually see that impermanence and mind only reveal a totally different take on the ultimate truth. You can't see it because you're fixating on appearances in your mind and thinking they're out there. But the same things happens in your dreams. The protagonist in your dreams is convinced that he or she is a real character, that there's something to achieve by going here and doing this and doing that. And then when you wake up, you realize it was all a subconscious projection onto the screen of your own mind, which was totally convincing for the duration, which had no reality whatsoever when you woke up. Now, this life that we call the awakened state, or not sleeping, is similarly another dream. And we are similarly experiencing the appearances that arise in our own minds. We are not seeing that they're radically unreal because they're radically impermanent. But we are fixated on getting something out of them, some kind of satisfaction, some type of meaning. And there we are. And it's called samsara, being fixated on the appearances in your own mind rather than seeing the light of the infinite consciousness, which is beyond and behind them. So these two insights come from recognizing the spaciousness of pristine consciousness and abiding there. The insights are radically transformative when they come.
That's a wonderful explanation. Thank you very much for that. Gary?
Hey, I think it's been great. Jon, you have anything you want to put out there? You want to tie it up, or Roger in any way?
Well, the only comments I would close with for the listener, for the viewer, is just to keep in mind that this is a very simple path. It's very simple, and it's not meant to be complex at all or complicated. And for a person out there, a seeker, who is simply saying, I would like to understand non-duality, non-doership, or this fixed sense of self that I have, I would like to start breaking that down. Ati Yoga is a path that takes you there. If a person were to listen to this and say, no, in fact, I would like to really not explore that, then I would say this isn't for you. But those are the words that I would use, the closing words, to really define for a listener whether they want to continue to pursue or go down this road. For me, is the simplest, most effective, direct means possible to get to where I am today, and I'm grateful for it. And if anyone identifies with that, the experience I had and what took me to where I am today, then this is for you.
Great summary. Jon, how about you, Roger? And then we'll go to Stefan.
I've always had tremendous faith in the wisdom and the realization of the great spiritual masters. So when I came as far as Dzogchen, and I learned that the pure original teachings from which Dzogchen was concocted were given out to the world by Garab Dorje. The body of his teachings is called the Semde Source Texts. When I began to read those, many things fell into place, perhaps by grace, or perhaps because the clear, strong light of Garab Dorje's wisdom. I felt I wanted to take and put his words into a clear, readable source, because the power, the transformative power of his wisdom could then touch the lives and hearts of other spiritual seekers. So that was why the book was written. So very early on, I shared the book with Gary. He saw that there was something very special in it. And then together, we opened the Facebook group. Jon joined very early on. And within the last year, with transmission, he and several other people have come to the same point of direct connection with wisdom and continuous transmission that makes all of these teachings fall into place and basically eliminates most of the questions. So anybody can follow along this route. The easy starting point is get the book and read it. Next one is set aside time for meditation. If it helps you, use a recording which cuts through your thinking activity, and ask me or Jon or Gary any questions anytime. There's no charge for any of this. It's all free of charge. There's no financial aspect to it whatsoever. So spiritual seekers who are sincere about this could begin by following some of these steps, and I would encourage them to do so. That would be my final comment.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Works for me. Okay, is that a wrap?
I think it's a wrap.
Because Jon had his final comments, Roger had his final comments. I have nothing more to add except to say this has been a great session. I can't wait to play it back. It's so rich. There's so much to absorb again and again. But as Roger points out, and as Jon points out, it's really very simple. This is not a complicated message at all, but it has to be, explored and looked at if one feels so moved.
It's only as complicated as your mind makes it,
That's
for
it.
sure. And I'd like to thank you both for inviting me today. This is my very first, I guess you could say, video interview. So it was a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, thank you, Jon. Thanks, Roger. And
Thank
Stefan and I will hang out and do our post-game analysis.
It's been a great
Okay.
pleasure, you guys. It's been a great pleasure.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, take care.
Bye.
Okay, so that was Roger and Jon. I thought that was pretty rich.
It was very rich. It was very rich because you and I and Roger and Jon have been going back and forth on Messenger, going out of our minds, trying to come up with these concepts to talk about. And of course, I was being my stubborn self, throwing
It was good.
gas on the fire.
Listen, it was good. I saw that as being your role because you have to push back sometimes. Again, people come out with their shtick. Okay, it's fine, but let's get some clarity here. I thought both Roger and Jon handled it very well.
They did. I mean, it really unfolded into what I wanted it to be something that was simple enough for everybody who would be listening. This isn't Harvard professors that have tenure for 20 years. This is us trying to share with everybody new ways of finding something that they're looking for in their life. And I want it to be as simple as possible for them not to scratch their head and say, goodbye, I'm not listening to this anymore.
Hey, it's all about ordinary people, looking for something that is ultimately extraordinary, and yet at the same time, it's ultimately ordinary, which segues into, speaking of ordinary people, our next guests. We have Steve and Leif, it's a great segue, I'll tell you why. Because those two guys are very ordinary people, and what we're going to talk about is, we talked about Roger's book today. Okay, fine. So next week, we're going to talk about Peter Brown's book, The Yoga of Radiant Presence, and I'll tell you, I think you'll see, and I think I'll see how much in sync both things are. Peter Brown and, with his shtick, it's going to be fun. So it's not just two separate things here. I think with next week's, with my friends Steve and Leif, they also know Jon Arsenault, but that's another. In other words, we're going to see it's a continuation of the same. We will see, I'll bet, it's a continuation of the same conversation we just had with Roger and Jon. I'm looking forward to it.
So am I. I'm ready to be enlightened. And in the meantime, I got to find my soul. My poor soul is crying for me.
Hold on, as Roger would say, Stefan, you're already enlightened already. I don't know what, recognize. That's what you have to recognize.
Well, I'm going to transport myself out of here, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.